The sharp clink of a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute silenced the opulent dining room of the Sapphire Lounge. Nathaniel Whitmore stood at the head of the table, his smile radiating practiced, predatory charm as he raised his glass toward Julian's wife, Victoria. "To our newest vice president," Nathaniel announced, his gaze flicking toward Julian. She succeeded despite the anchors tying her down. Julian sat perfectly still, feeling the cold, hard weight of a crumpled hotel receipt in his tuxedo pocket. He smiled softly, deciding to let him finish his toast. After tonight, their fragile empire of lies would burn. Asterisk if you find yourself captivated by the hidden shadows behind perfect marriages, subscribe to our channel and stay for the whole story. The crystal chandelier at the Sapphire Lounge cast a cold, fragmented light over the private dining room. Surrounding the long mahogany table were the elite players of Whitmore Capital, their faces masked with polite, predatory smiles. At the center of it all sat Victoria. She wore a deep emerald gown that caught the ambient light, her posture impeccable, her eyes shining with the thrill of absolute victory. Beside her sat Julian, her husband of 10 years, playing the role of the supportive, slightly overshadowed spouse to perfection. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice boomed, cutting through the low hum of corporate chatter. Nathaniel Whitmore, the CEO and the man who held Victoria's career in his manicured hands, stood at the head of the table. He tapped his silver spoon against a flute of vintage champagne. The room immediately fell into a hushed, reverent silence. Nathaniel was a man who commanded attention not through volume, but through the sheer weight of his arrogance. "We are here tonight to celebrate a milestone," Nathaniel began, his voice smooth as aged bourbon. He turned his gaze toward Victoria, a look that lingered just a fraction of a second too long. "To Victoria, our newest vice president." A murmur of applause rippled through the room. Julian clapped slowly, his face an unreadable mask. "Victoria is a force of nature," Nathaniel continued, pacing slowly behind her chair. He placed a hand on the back of her seat, his fingertips brushing the silk of her dress. "She is relentless. She is brilliant. And frankly, she succeeded despite the anchors tying her down." Nathaniel's eyes shifted, locking directly onto Julian. It was a subtle execution, a public castration wrapped in corporate praise. The implication hung heavy in the air. Asterisk, "She made it despite you." Julian felt a familiar burning sensation in his chest, but he did not flinch. He reached for his glass of scotch, taking a slow, measured sip. Inside the inner breast pocket of his tailored Tom Ford jacket, right over his heart, rested a folded piece of paper. It was a receipt from the Meridian, a boutique luxury hotel across town. "Room 412. 2 nights ago." Booked under Nathaniel Whitmore's corporate account, but with Victoria's signature hastily scrawled at the bottom for room service. Julian watched his wife blush perfectly at Nathaniel's words. He saw the way she tilted her neck, exposing her throat in a subconscious display of submission to the man standing behind her. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. Julian let Nathaniel finish his toast. He let them all raise their glasses, let them drink to a success built on the ashes of his marriage. As the glasses lowered, Victoria turned to Julian, placing her hand over his. Her skin was ice cold. "Are you all right, darling?" she whispered, her eyes searching his face for any sign of fracture. "You seem quiet." Julian looked down at her hand, noticing the subtle absence of the calluses she used to have when they first started building their life together. Now, her hands were perfectly manicured weapons. "I'm perfectly fine, Victoria," Julian replied, his voice a low, terrifying calm. "I'm just anticipating the dessert course. I have a feeling it's going to be unforgettable." The memory of how he acquired the damning piece of paper in his pocket was a sharp, jagged stone in Julian's mind. Only 48 hours prior, the penthouse they shared high above the restless hum of Manhattan had felt like a sanctuary. That illusion had evaporated on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Julian had been searching for his passport in Victoria's mahogany study, planning a surprise anniversary trip to the Amalfi Coast. Instead, tucked discreetly behind a row of leather-bound first editions, he found a sleek, black leather folio. It was not meant for his eyes. Inside was a platinum credit card statement under a shell corporation he vaguely recognized from her late-night conference calls. The charges were a geographic map of infidelity, exorbitant dinners at the Velvet Room, discreet car services, and recurring, massive tabs at the Meridian. But it was not just the paper trail that had drained the blood from Julian's face. Beneath the folio, wrapped in a velvet pouch, lay a heavy, rose-gold timepiece. A Vacheron Constantin. Julian knew watches. He knew the intricate mechanics, the staggering price tags, and more importantly, he knew he had never purchased this for his wife. His fingers had trembled slightly as he turned the cold metal over in the afternoon light. Engraved on the back, in elegant, looping script, were 3 words, asterisk to our time. N.W. Nathaniel Whitmore. In that solitary moment in her study, the foundation of Julian's decade-long marriage had silently turned to dust. The late nights at the office, the sudden, aggressive promotions, the way Victoria's perfume had subtly shifted from floral to something darker, heavier. It all clicked together with a sickening precision. She was not just climbing the corporate ladder. She was sleeping with the man who owned it. Julian had stood there, the heavy watch in his palm, feeling a primal urge to hurl it through the floor-to-ceiling window. The dilemma had paralyzed him. He could confront her the second she walked through the door, demanding answers, screaming until his voice gave out. But if he erupted in a fit of jealous rage, he would become the hysterical, insecure husband. He would lose his dignity, and Victoria, with her sharp, analytical mind, would spin the narrative, leaving him with nothing. Instead, he had carefully photographed the statement, placed the watch exactly as he had found it, and slipped one of the hotel receipts into his pocket. He chose the psychological torture of silence. He chose to let the poison seep into his veins so he could study the venom. Now, sitting at the opulent table in the Sapphire Lounge, surrounded by the clinking of crystal and the hollow laughter of sycophants, Julian felt the phantom weight of that watch ticking against his own pulse. The silver cloches were lifted in unison by a fleet of white-gloved waiters, releasing the rich aroma of truffles and seared wagyu into the private dining room. The conversation around the table swelled, a cacophony of corporate sycophancy and forced laughter. Julian, however, existed in a vacuum of sharp, hyper-focused silence. He was no longer a participant in this celebratory dinner. He was an investigator analyzing a crime scene in real time. He watched his wife. Victoria was a masterclass in composed elegance, nodding thoughtfully as the head of acquisitions recounted a tedious golf anecdote. But Julian knew her tells. He knew the slight parting of her lips when her adrenaline spiked, and the way her left shoulder dipped a fraction of an inch when she was trying to conceal something. Nathaniel sat at her right, holding court. To the untrained eye, he was simply an attentive CEO fostering his top talent. But Julian saw the invisible tether connecting them. Every time Nathaniel made a point, his eyes flicked to Victoria for validation. It was a secret, silent dialogue happening in plain sight, a lingering glance here, a shared, imperceptible smirk there. They were entirely consumed by the thrill of their proximity, drunk on the power of keeping their affair hidden in a room full of their peers. The true agony, however, was happening beneath the heavy linen tablecloth. Julian shifted in his chair, purposefully letting his silk napkin slip from his lap. He leaned down slowly to retrieve it. In the shadowed space beneath the table, the truth was laid bare. Nathaniel's polished leather Oxford was pressed intimately against the side of Victoria's stiletto. Even more damning, Nathaniel's left hand, supposedly resting on his own thigh, had crossed the invisible boundary between their chairs. His fingers were casually, possessively tracing the hem of Victoria's emerald gown near her knee. Victoria did not pull away. She leaned into the touch. Julian picked up his napkin and sat back up, his face a mask of stone. His heart hammered violently against his ribs, a physical pain radiating through his chest. The sheer audacity of it left a metallic taste in his mouth. She had held his hand just moments ago with skin like ice, yet she melted into the illicit heat of her boss's touch beneath the table. His fingers tightened around the stem of his wine glass. The glass groaned under the pressure. The dilemma tore at his restraint. It would take only a second to stand up, to expose the sordid reality of Whitmore Capital's newest vice president right then and there. But Julian inhaled deeply, forcing his fingers to uncurl. He would not give them the satisfaction of his destruction. He would not be the irrational, jealous husband breaking down in public. Julian, Nathaniel's voice suddenly cut through the hum of the room, drawing the attention of the table. You haven't touched your steak. I hope the culinary standards here aren't falling short of your expectations. Julian met Nathaniel's predatory gaze, a slow, chilling smile forming on his lips. Not at all, Nathaniel, Julian replied, his voice carrying effortlessly over the low hum of the private room. He picked up his heavy silver steak knife, turning it slowly in the dim chandelier light. I was merely admiring the presentation. It is truly remarkable how much meticulous effort goes into making something appear flawless on the surface, isn't it? To hide the reality underneath. Nathaniel chuckled, though his eyes narrowed into calculating slits. Presentation is everything in our business, Julian. You should know that. It's about creating immense value where others see none, and extracting maximum returns, regardless of the hidden costs, Julian countered smoothly. He sliced into the rare wagyu. A vivid ribbon of red pooled onto the pristine white porcelain, stark and violent. Victoria has always been exceptional at that. Assessing value. Leveraging assets to their absolute limit. I remember when I first introduced her to your inner circle, Nathaniel. 10 years ago, at the St. James Foundation Gala. She had no connections then, only raw, unpolished ambition. It's fascinating looking back at how she analyzed the room, calculating exactly whose hands she needed to shake. I suppose I was simply the very first door she needed to pry open. Victoria's spine turned to steel. The illicit, roaming stroke of Nathaniel's hand beneath the linen tablecloth ceased instantly. She set her crystal wine glass down, the sharp clink cutting through the ambient noise. Julian, darling, she breathed, her voice stretched thin with an artificial, brittle sweetness. You make me sound incredibly ruthless. Doesn't it require a certain breed of ruthlessness to secure the vice president's suite, Victoria? Julian met her gaze, his expression a terrifying void. He shifted his attention back to the CEO, his tone dropping to a conversational murmur that held the weight of an anvil. Speaking of time and investments, Nathaniel, I must commend your exquisite taste. I was recently admiring a Vacheron Constantin, a stunning rose gold piece. It made me realize how easily men lose track of time when they are heavily invested in covert acquisitions. The air in their immediate vicinity evaporated. The surrounding executives, blissfully deaf to the lethal subtext, continued their sycophantic chatter, but the triangle of Julian, Victoria, and Nathaniel had plunged into a suffocating, icy vacuum. Nathaniel's practiced, arrogant smirk froze into a grimace, the muscles in his jaw ticking erratically. Victoria's perfect, glowing complexion drained of all color. Her eyes darted frantically between her husband and her lover, the panic finally breaking through her meticulously crafted facade. Time is indeed our most precious commodity, Nathaniel finally managed, his smooth voice suddenly contaminated with a trace of gravel. One must spend it carefully. Oh, I agree completely, Julian murmured, bringing his glass of scotch to his lips. In fact, I believe the true dividends of this evening's performance are just about to be paid out. Julian savored the rich burn of the liquor, basking in the sudden, palpable terror radiating from his wife. The trap was set. The suffocating tension in the private dining room finally reached a fever pitch. Victoria stood abruptly, her emerald gown catching the light as she muttered a strained excuse about needing to powder her nose. The panicked, desperate look she shot Julian was unmistakable. It was a summons. Julian waited exactly 3 agonizing minutes, letting the silence gnaw at her nerves before he quietly excused himself, his face an impassive mask. The hallway leading to the restrooms of the Sapphire Lounge was a dimly lit corridor of mirrored walls and dark velvet. smelling faintly of expensive perfume and ozone. Victoria was waiting for him, pacing like a caged animal. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, her composure shattered. "What the hell are you doing, Julian?" she hissed, her voice a serrated whisper that bounced off the mirrors. Her eyes were wide, frantic, darting toward the main dining room as if Nathaniel might materialize through the velvet. "Are you out of your mind? You're embarrassing me in front of the entire board." Julian leaned back against the dark wallpaper, crossing his arms slowly. He let the silence stretch, watching her meticulously crafted facade disintegrate. "Embarrassing you?" he repeated softly, the words dripping with ice. "I thought I was merely participating in the celebratory toasts. Celebrating your relentless ambition." Victoria stepped into his personal space, her perfectly manicured finger jabbing into his chest. "Stop playing games. I know what you're doing. You're threatened. You've always been threatened by my success, by the fact that I've outgrown the pathetic little box you built for me 10 years ago. You're deliberately trying to sabotage my promotion because you can't handle that I don't need you anymore." The sheer, venomous audacity of her projection hit Julian like a physical blow. The dilemma roared to life in his chest. He could pull the crumpled hotel receipt from his pocket right now. He could shove the Vacheron Constantine statement in her face and watch her arrogant self-righteousness turn to ashes in the dim hallway. He could scream until his throat bled. But staring at the woman he had loved, the woman who was currently weaponizing his own career stagnation to cover her infidelity, the rage crystallized into something cold, hard, and utterly detached. "Outgrown me," Julian murmured, tasting the bitter irony. He reached up, gently capturing her wrist and removing her finger from his chest with a terrifying, deliberate slowness. "Is that what you call room 412 at the Meridian, Victoria? Growth?" The blood drained instantly from Victoria's face, leaving her looking hollow, like a mannequin stripped of its paint. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The frantic energy vanished, replaced by a suffocating, paralyzing terror. "You think I'm playing a game," Julian said, his voice dropping to a near-silent, lethal whisper as he leaned closer, inhaling the scent of her fear. "But I assure you, my love, the game is already over. I'm just here for the final act." He released her wrist, leaving her trembling in the mirrored hallway, and turned back toward the dining room. Julian re-entered the private dining room. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind him, sealing away the panicked ghost of his wife in the hallway. He slid back into his chair, the clatter of silverware and the drone of sycophantic laughter washing over him. The leather chair next to him was empty. Victoria was taking her time, no doubt desperately trying to reassemble her shattered composure and formulate a defense strategy. Next to her untouched crystal water goblet sat her phone. It was a sleek, rose gold model, resting face up on the white linen. Usually, Victoria guarded it with the paranoia of a state secret, but in her frantic rush to the restroom, she had left it behind. Julian's eyes locked onto the screen. It was dark, but a faint, pulsing notification light blinked rhythmically, a beacon of hidden truths. Julian's pulse drummed a slow, heavy beat against his ribs. The dilemma clawed at his chest. He already knew about the affair. He had the hotel receipts and the watch engraving. But a darker, more insidious instinct told him that the rabbit hole went deeper. Did he want to know the true foundation of his own destruction? Did he want to read the raw, unfiltered evidence that his decade-long marriage was built on something far more sinister than a midlife office romance? His hand moved almost of its own accord. He reached across the invisible boundary of her place setting and picked up the device. He knew her passcode. It was the date of their first anniversary, a bitter, twisted irony that made his stomach churn as he tapped the digits. The screen bloomed to life, instantly illuminating a text thread with her sister, Emily. Julian's eyes scanned the glowing blue bubbles. The words blurred at first, then snapped into sharp, agonizing focus. Asterisk Emily. Are you seriously going through with the promotion dinner with Julian there? That's cold, Vic. Even for you. Asterisk Victoria. I have to. The optics demand the supportive husband routine. One more night of this charade. Nathaniel promised the VP spot, is locked down. Once the ink dries on the contract next week, I'm filing the papers. I don't need Julian's connections anymore. The air in Julian's lungs turned to shattered glass. He scrolled up, his thumb swiping through months of casual, callous dismissals of their life together. Asterisk Emily. 10 years is a long time to fake it. Do you even feel bad? Asterisk Victoria. Bad? Please. Julian was a stepping stone. He got me into the St. James Foundation galas. He introduced me to the board. He served his purpose. I married his network. Not him. Nathaniel is my endgame. He's the actual power. Julian stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in his hollow eyes. The affair was devastating, but this was annihilation. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a moment of weakness. His entire marriage, every shared laugh, every anniversary, every late-night conversation about their future was a meticulously executed corporate acquisition. He had been a rung on her ladder, a temporary asset to be leveraged and discarded when a better return on investment presented itself. The phone vibrated softly in his hand. A new message from Nathaniel popped onto the screen, sent from just across the table. Asterisk Nathaniel, damage control. Tell me exactly what he knows. Julian slowly placed the phone back precisely where he found it, face down. He looked up, his eyes meeting Nathaniel's across the silver cloches and crystal flutes. A chilling, dead calm washed over him, erasing the last traces of the man Victoria thought she had married. Victoria finally slipped back into the private dining room, her posture rigid, her face a mask of pale, breathless porcelain. She took her seat next to Julian, her eyes immediately darting to her rose-gold phone. It sat face down on the white linen, exactly where she had left it. She exhaled a silent, trembling breath of relief, entirely unaware that the digital guillotine had already fallen. Across the table, Nathaniel caught her eye, a silent question passing between them. Victoria offered a tight, reassuring nod. The white-gloved waitstaff moved in silent synchronicity, clearing the dinner plates and replacing them with a dark, bitter chocolate fondant and pours of a heavy, vintage port wine. The ambient chatter of the Whitmore Capital executives began to rise once more, the sycophantic praise returning to its natural rhythm. Julian let the noise swell for exactly 1 minute. Then, he reached for his crystal water goblet and his silver dessert spoon. Asterisk clink, clink, clink. The sharp, ringing sound cut through the heavy air of the Sapphire Lounge like a surgeon's scalpel. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Faces turned. The room fell into an expectant, absolute silence. Julian stood up slowly, buttoning the center button of his Tom Ford jacket with agonizing deliberation. He did not look like a defeated man. He looked like an apex predator who had just locked the doors to the cage. Earlier this evening, Julian began, his voice a smooth, resonant baritone that carried effortlessly to the darkest corners of the room. Nathaniel spoke eloquently about the nature of success, about the forces of nature, the relentless drive, and the anchors that must be discarded to achieve vertical mobility. He paused, letting his eyes sweep across the faces of the senior partners, the chief financial officer, the head of human resources. Finally, his gaze settled on his wife. Victoria's hands were gripped together in her lap, so tightly her knuckles were bone white. I find myself uniquely positioned to expand on that corporate philosophy, Julian continued, picking up his glass of port. Because 10 years ago, I made an investment. An angel investment in a startup with zero capital, no industry connections, but a truly breathtaking reserve of raw ambition. I provided the foundational network, the St. James family name, the invitations to the right galas, the introductions to the very board members sitting at this table today. A profound discomfort began to ripple through the room. The CFO shifted uneasily. The air grew suddenly, suffocatingly cold. Julian, Nathaniel warned, his voice low and laced with a sudden, sharp panic. This is hardly the time or the venue for a retrospective. I have the floor, Nathaniel. Julian interrupted, his tone soft but laced with an absolute, terrifying authority that nailed the seal to his chair. As I was saying, in any high-stakes venture, one must continuously audit the assets. You have to watch for hidden liabilities, off-the-books transactions. For instance, a smart auditor might notice exorbitant, recurring charges at the Meridian Hotel, specifically Room 412, a rather discreet location for late-night private equity negotiations. Victoria let out a microscopic, choked gasp. The blood entirely abandoned her face. She looked at Julian with eyes wide with pure, unadulterated horror. An auditor might also notice unregulated compensation, Julian murmured, his eyes drifting lazily to Nathaniel's left wrist. A Vacheron Constantine rose gold timepiece, perhaps, engraved with a personalized message to mark the exact moment an asset was stripped of its moral value. The silence in the room was no longer just expectant, it was toxic. The executives were not stupid people. The corporate metaphors had dissolved, leaving behind the stark, ugly reality of what they were witnessing. The VP of Human Resources lowered her gaze to her lap, her face flushed with mortification. But the most fascinating discovery of all, Julian said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow echoed louder than a shout, is reading the internal communications. The private memos between the asset and her sister, detailing how the initial investor was merely a stepping stone. A temporary holding company to be liquidated the moment the vice president contract was signed and the merger with the CEO was finalized. Nathaniel's face contorted into a mask of ugly, naked fury. He opened his mouth to speak, to salvage his decimated authority, but he had nothing. There was no defense against the precision of Julian's strike. Julian raised his glass of dark wine, holding it up toward the frozen, shattered figures of his wife and her lover. You have mastered the art of the hostile takeover, Victoria, Julian said, his voice devoid of any anger, leaving only a chilling, hollow finality. But you fundamentally misunderstood the market. You believed my silence was ignorance. It was simply the due diligence required before a total divestment. He took a slow sip of the port, the dark liquid staining his lips like blood. To the new vice president of Whitmore Capital, Julian concluded, staring directly into Victoria's weeping, terrified eyes. May your new title keep you warm. Because your foundational capital is officially entirely bankrupt. Julian set the crystal glass down on the mahogany table. It landed with a dull, heavy thud that sounded distinctly like a coffin sealing shut. The silence that followed Julian's words was a physical weight pressing down on the private dining room of the Sapphire Lounge. The elite players of Whitmore Capital sat paralyzed, their sycophantic smiles replaced by expressions of acute, agonizing discomfort. Nathaniel's face had drained of its arrogant, predatory charm, leaving behind a pallid, furious mask. His jaw clenched so tightly the muscles jumped beneath his skin, but he remained utterly speechless. He had been outplayed in his own arena, exposed not just as an adulterer, but as a man who weaponized his corporate power for a sordid, calculated acquisition. Beside him, Victoria had crumpled into a pathetic, trembling figure. Her hands were pressed over her mouth, her eyes wide and glassy with unshed tears that threatened to ruin her impeccable makeup. The vibrant emerald gown that had radiated absolute victory mere minutes ago now looked like a shroud. She stared at Julian, waiting for him to erupt, to scream, to offer her some twisted opportunity to beg or explain. But Julian offered nothing. He didn't spare them another glance. He didn't look at the CFO who had suddenly developed a deep fascination with his water glass, or the head of human resources whose face was flushed with the sheer, radioactive scandal of the moment. Julian simply turned his back on the wreckage he had meticulously orchestrated. He walked out of the heavy oak doors, his footsteps echoing in the opulent, dimly lit hallway. The air outside the private room felt instantly cleaner, devoid of the suffocating scent of truffles and betrayal. He retrieved his cashmere overcoat from the coat check, tipping the attendant with a crisp bill, his movements smooth and practiced. Stepping out onto the cold, damp pavement of Manhattan, Julian hailed a cab. The city was a blur of neon lights and relentless motion, a sharp contrast to the cold, dead stillness settling inside his chest. The adrenaline of the confrontation was beginning to fade, replaced by a hollow, expansive ache. 10 years. 10 years of building a life, of late-night conversations, of shared holidays and inside jokes, all revealed to be a meticulously executed corporate strategy. The cab pulled up to the grand entrance of their penthouse building. The doorman greeted him with a polite nod, oblivious to the fact that Julian was returning not as a husband, but as a ghost. The elevator ride to the top floor felt like an eternity. When the polished steel doors slid open, Julian stepped into the foyer of the home he had bought for them. The air was still thick with the lingering scent of her expensive floral perfume. The modern art they had chosen together hung on the walls, suddenly looking like props in a staged play. He didn't bother turning on the main lights. The city's glow filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the imported hardwood floors. Julian walked methodically through the silent rooms, feeling a profound sense of detachment. He entered the master bedroom, the massive king-sized bed perfectly made, completely sterile. He moved to his mahogany dresser. Julian unbuttoned his cuffs and slowly slid the heavy gold wedding band off his left ring finger. The metal felt alien now, a symbol of a contract that had been voided long ago. He stared at the indentation it had left on his skin, a pale, unbroken circle of absent sun. It was the only physical proof that he had been married at all. He set the ring down on the polished wood surface. It made a sharp, definitive clink in the quiet room. Beside it, he laid the crumpled receipt from the Meridian Hotel and the printed photograph of the Vacheron Constantin statement. A neat, curated exhibit of their mutual destruction. He knew she would come back. She would stumble through the door in a panic, desperate to salvage the optics of her life, to beg for forgiveness, or perhaps to negotiate a settlement that wouldn't destroy her newly acquired vice presidency. But Julian would not be there. He picked up a pre-packed leather duffel bag from the closet, a bag he had packed the afternoon he found the watch. He slung it over his shoulder and walked toward the front door, the heavy silence of the penthouse pressing against his back. He didn't look back as he closed the door behind him. The lock clicked into place with a sound like a gavel striking wood. Julian stood alone in the hallway, the cold marble floor beneath his feet. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the first real breath he felt he had taken in months. The pain was still there, a jagged, bleeding wound in his chest, but beneath it was something harder, something resilient. The best investment I ever made was walking away with my soul intact.